Hi, everyone. Welcome to the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International's monthly series, Living the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Today's webinar is going to be focused on Article 5, which reaffirms women's right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Article 5 states as follows: states should uphold women's rights to peaceful assembly and freedom of association with others. This should include the right of women and girls to assemble and associate as women or girls based on their sex, and the right of lesbians to assemble and associate on the basis of their common sexual orientation without including men who claim to have female gender identities. So tonight we're here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the importance of women-only spaces and the right to freedom of assembly. And we'll talk about what this might have to do with our fall convention, Reigniting the Women's Liberation Movement in Washington, D.C., September 23rd to 25th. So I'm so happy to have you all here and to everyone watching the video. So I will turn it and I should say all of our speakers here tonight are members of the board of WDI USA, and we wanted to take this opportunity to celebrate the right to peacefully assemble by talking a little bit more about our fall convention. So everyone who's speaking tonight is on the board of WDI USA. One of our board members, Lorraine Nolan, unfortunately could not be with us tonight. She had something come up. She wishes she could be here, but she can't. So we hope that everything is going okay with Lorraine. So with that, I will turn it to Katherine Kinney, who is going to talk about her understanding of the importance of women-only spaces and the importance of women's right to peacefully assemble. Katherine, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for being here tonight. So the first part of the fifth article, of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights reads, reaffirming women's right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Especially here in the US, I think a lot of us tend to hear freedom of assembly, and we tend to think of the form of assembly like protesting. But this article of the Declaration doesn't necessarily have to do specifically or even primarily with protesting. Assembling publicly in order to protest is, of course, incredibly important, but this series is called Living the Declaration. And so I want to veer a little bit away from the protesting, which is sort of right in front of us, and talk about an aspect of feminist assembly that I think is really important, but I don't think it's talked about enough, and that is joyful assembly. So for context, I studied sociology in school, and one of the reasons that I loved it was that even though women have been historically very underrepresented in it, as in basically every other field, I thought a lot of the concepts of sociology translated really well to feminism, and it changed the way I looked at women's issues and activism. So I have to make reference to a man real quick, please forgive me. Emile Durkheim was one of the three founders of sociology, and he was really interested in how societies maintain their cohesion. So what holds a society? That can be any type of group, a nation, a country, and smaller groups as well. What holds a society together when there are so many different things that could pull it apart? And as part of his explanation for what does hold societies together, he came up with the term collective effervescence. Collective effervescence is a coming together in which members of a group are simultaneously communicating the same thought or participating in the same action. So the classic examples of large-scale collective effervescence are religion and sports. So take a traditional Catholic Mass, for example. Generally, that involves a lot of crossing yourself at the same time as everyone else, kneeling with everyone, standing with everyone, praying out loud together. You are engaging in the same actions and you're saying the same words or giving voice to the same thoughts. Or somewhat similarly, at a sports game, you have a similar dynamic of large groups of people chanting together at the same time, cheering together. And, when your team scores, everyone in the stands just rises up at once and screams. So the group action of collective effervescence is often ritualized, like in the examples I just described with sports and religion, where the actions are predictable and feel meaningful to the group in some way. So what this does for the individual is it results in a feeling of unity, oneness, and energy, or effervescence, from collective effervescence. The individual person, essentially, is lost in the feeling of the collective. And collective effervescence, it turns out, is really quite important. What does it do? It reaffirms the importance of our social bonds. It reminds us of the existence of something larger than ourselves. Durkheim once described it actually as worship of the group itself. It reminds us of who we are, what we stand for, and what we're fighting for. And it can't fully erase our interpersonal struggles, but it does often manage to put them into perspective with a reminder of, like I said, who we are, what we stand for, and what we're fighting for. So even though sports and religion are the classic examples of it, we can also find it at much smaller scales as well. Essentially, it can happen anywhere where members of the same group are doing the same action or voicing the same words. So between just a couple people, I believe we can see it in things like the familiarity of inside jokes, that sort of thrill you get when you and another person finish each other's sentences, or the unexpected delight that comes from two people saying the same thing at the same time. So to tie this back to feminism, I really believe that we need to seek feminist collective effervescence wherever we can find it. And what I really hope for us as a movement is that we're able to think more about how we can cultivate it in our assemblies, both large and very small. Like I said, I think we can find it even between just two people. Obviously, there's a lot wrong with the world we're in, and I understand that a lot of women feel this pressure that to be very goal-oriented, very focused, always productive. And in our limited time together, there's often this urge to spend every minute of that time together planning actions, analyzing current events, and so on and so forth. There's definitely a time and a place to be focused and single-minded, but I think there's also a time to focus on what's more abstract and can feel kind of fluffy, and that's reinforcing the bonds that hold us together, reinforcing our notion of what the group is and why it matters, and that it matters. Building relationships, shared references, and shared trust isn't a waste of time. Long-term, especially long-term, it becomes absolutely essential. So I would suggest trying to find collective effervescence with other women, with other feminists, wherever you can find it. Go camping, go dancing, sing karaoke, form inside jokes with one another, cook for one another. Whatever, do anything else which comes to mind that creates unity between the individual and the group and reminds us of what we're all fighting for together. I really think that if we try to do this more, we'll be rewarded with renewed energy, focus, and creativity, with a new take on the relationship between individual and collective, and also with a sense of security about our place in the world and in the movement. As humans, we're social creatures, and we need to feel the strength of our social bonds and our belonging in order to feel secure. And only when we feel secure are we really going to have the flexibility, resilience, and freedom, both as individuals and as a collective, that the feminist movement requires from us. That's all for me.
Thanks so much, Katherine. That was really, really interesting, and I really appreciated it a lot. So next we will hear from Marian Rutigliano. Marian is the current secretary of the board of WDI USA, and we're very happy to have her with us tonight. Go ahead, Marian.
Hi. That was a great framework. I'm older. I want to talk about what I experienced and what happened because of it, what it was like. I mean, young women who may be lesbians, it's so difficult now to even find themselves. I was 13 years old and had kind of been thinking about it and lived in New York City, and happened when I was 13 years old to walk into this group of these women who were daughters of Bilitis. And if you don't know who they were a social group for lesbians that formed in the 40s, late 40s. And you may think a social group, okay, big deal. What did they do? But that was a huge thing back then. That was absolutely huge because there were no places to meet lesbians. There was no place safe for them to be. So to just meet was like almost a political action itself, just to socialize. And I, had been kind of thinking about it in the library, happened to walk into this room where, they were just socializing meeting, saw two women kiss, and it was like I found the grail. And they, and which it must have looked like, because they just laughed at me, and said, said, it's lesbian. This is probably what you are. which was great. I mean, I didn't have to go through the next 10 years of my life struggling and wondering, could it be, what is it? That's what happened. And that happened to a lot of women then, to a lot of young women then, women who were older too, who just were kind of wondering. You could walk into spaces. There were places you could go and walk into spaces and see women loving women. And it was a closed space, there were no men. I mean, the bartenders, would keep them out. There were no men. And it was freedom of assembly and freedom to find yourself. And then I got more involved into things like consciousness raising groups. There were discussions and things at coffee houses and bookstores strictly for women. And again, no men, not, and especially not the ones LARPing as women. But you got used to, you could talk, and the talk flowed freely. You got used to being able to say what was really on your mind. Women very, very quickly got over, saying things like, well, not all men are like that, or, all right, my guy is great. I mean, it's women understood and started to hear when we could speak freely among ourselves. Oh my gosh, you feel that way too. How many other women feel this way? And you started to realize that there were hundreds and hundreds. I mean, every woman felt the same way you did about things. And you could speak freely. Women did not pull any punches in their speech, and it was not hate speech to slam the oppressors. And you learned really early that you could say what you wanted to. There was nobody there to say, oh, you're being, you're not being fair to men. I mean, it was free speech, and you learned. You just absorbed speaking freely, because it was it was closed. Exclusion means boundaries, and the freedom of speech, and the bonding that it gave you with other women, because you found out, oh my God, they're just like me, was amazing. There's nothing like it. And then there were women's festivals. The best known one is the Michigan Women's Festivals, and early on it was truly strictly women. There were, I know some people like to say, oh, there were trans people there then. No, they weren't at the beginning. They really weren't. But it was such a profound difference. And being in a place like that was just all women. Safety was a really big thing. Just physical safety and emotional safety. If you hear loud male voices, you're like in a campground or something, and you hear really, really loud male voices, you start to get on edge, and you don't even realize how much on edge you are until you're in this place where the only loud voices you hear are women's voices. You're not worrying about, are they going to get out of control? Are they going to get violent? Are they going to fight? Is there going to be sexual assault? Because it just doesn't happen in all women's spaces. You fall asleep hearing only women's voices. You sleep in a tent on a hot night with the nylon, just screens and stuff like that, and you know that nobody's going to be walking past and looking in and perving on you. You walked around alone at night, in the middle of the night, just to walk in the dark stillness or to go to the bathroom with no fear, and you don't realize the difference until you experience it. But the ability to set boundaries, to exclude, it makes you learn that this is how life should be and could be. And the tendency to say, oh, well, it's another way now, and it's better than nothing. It's not better than nothing. So what all this did, I've been out for over 50 years, is that when I bring this to what's currently happening, organizing for women's rights and opposing gender ideology, even some of the male, like, genderists say, well, it's perfectly okay for women to discuss endometriosis and pregnancy, but they really balk at women having women-only spaces for any other reason, because they say, when women talk about among ourselves, we all become Turks and we try to exclude the men who pretend to be women. Well, yeah, and that in and of itself knowing that in and of itself is one major reason why those are the spaces that we really need to be able to talk about this stuff. Being able to say whatever you want, including, or maybe especially, things that other people don't want you to ever say out loud, is exactly why we need women-only spaces, to talk among ourselves, to find and plan ways where we can, again, have everything that I had growing up, to allow lesbians to meet without the pressure of men, to be able to only include lesbians, exclude men, to have women be able to talk freely among ourselves without being censored, canceled, and harassed, to be able to just say really simple things like trans women are men are trash, whatever you want to say, things that would piss people off. That is just a staggering thing to be able to say in a space where your oppressors are not allowed, to create women-only sex-specific spaces again. We can't do that unless we can plan out of earshot of the people we want to exclude, which are men, and to be able to gather once again without being intruded upon or pressured to include the people who oppress us. I learned over these 50 plus years that women's community, exclusively women's community, is so profoundly different from even one man in there, that it is life-changing. And I want other women, I want young women to be able to know that.
That was great, Marian. Thank you so much. I know that when I've been in women-only spaces, I agree completely. You can feel the power of it, and you know that it's just completely different. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. Next, we will hear from Lauren Levey. Lauren is the Vice President of the US chapter of WDI. Let's hear what you've got to share, Lauren.
Thanks, Kara, and welcome to everybody here. I'm going to talk about some personal stuff that happened for me in the 1980s. So the first Women's Motorcycle Festival was held, I think, I was trying to find out, the earliest T-shirt that I found in the back of a drawer was had the year 1982 on it. So I think maybe that was the first year. So this Women's Motorcycle Festival was held, let's say, in 1982 in Western New York State, in the Finger Lakes region, which is not too far from Niagara Falls, so way west. I'd never before ridden in a large group of only women riders. About 80 or so women showed up for that first festival. For the most part, a woman riding, and this was true in the 80s, and this is true currently, a woman riding alone or with a mixed sex group gets perceived pretty weirdly by the public if she gets recognized as a woman. I get mistaken for a man, or I get recognized as female, but then I get gawked at, or I'm assumed to be in need of male advice or assistance for some reason, whether or not he's ever been on a motorcycle himself, you know what I mean? A perennial favorite opening line through the decades has been, "Did you ride that here?" To which I occasionally answer, "No, I pushed it here." I had come to believe, without realizing it, that women motorcyclists were all novices forever, and that I was a unique and isolated exception. This belief had been perhaps created and certainly supported by advertisements by motorcycle manufacturers that showed mostly male models, but an occasional young woman. She would always be shown in shiny new form-fitting leathers, her face unprotected so that you could see the makeup, you know. She'd be nervously riding a slow, cheap motorcycle with a male nearby on a better motorcycle, looking confident and commanding. And it had seeped in to my brain. I had come to subliminally believe that marketing trope without even realizing that I believed it. Maybe I'd seen women riding motorcycles and read them as male even. How embarrassing. So that first Women's Motorcycle Festival was a completely new experience for me. It was apparent on arrival, instantly, that the women were not focused on their physical appearance. We were unself-conscious physically. I think we were all lesbians, although I can't be certain. We were focused on doing physical stuff that we loved and being in the company of women, which we loved. What you saw on arriving at the campground was women everywhere you looked. They were pitching tents or working on their bikes or washing road grime off their bikes after a long trip, or asking if anybody wanted to go for a little ride to explore the area. We were focused on riding and what kind of bikes everybody else was riding and how they'd packed their luggage and on the joy of having found this unique sisterhood. The next day, we rode through, we did a loop, about a 100-mile loop, and part of it included a ride through a nearby town as a group of about 80 women, each operating her own motorcycle. People on the street didn't just gawk, they did double takes and triple takes as they slowly realized that every single motorcycle coming down Main Street in beautiful, tightly controlled formation was being operated by a woman. And to my amazement and delight, they spontaneously began to cheer. I mean, I guess people cheer when there's a parade. It was like that. I'm sure it was the women in the crowd who began to cheer first. But then it was contagious. Men cheered. Little girls ran after us. They asked for rides. We laughed and waved back and blew kisses and showed off, all the while maintaining our tight riding formation. Women had ridden to the festival from as far away as Florida and California. That's how much we wanted to be with each other. We were office workers, teachers, carpenters, police, army officers, and one professional custom motorcycle painter. But we were all women, and we all loved motorcycles, and having been deprived of each other for years, we just purely loved being together. We had wonderful conversations. We talked about motorcycle adventures we'd had, motorcycle designs and how they could be improved to fit women's bodies better, and what you could do in the aftermarket, what you could purchase cheap to make your motorcycle fit your body better. Make it lower, bring the handlebars back. We talked about motorcycle maintenance, roadside repairs, how to make your bike faster and more reliable and prettier, which motorcycle clothing brands fit us, how to ride faster in corners, how to ride more safely. These were highly skilled motorcyclists with a passion for our sport. I was dazzled with admiration for my sister's competence, courage, generosity, and humor. Needless to say, I returned to the festival year after year for as long as they had it, and it grew in size every year. We stayed in touch. Some of us went home and immediately formed local women's motorcycle clubs everywhere across the country. I was one of the founders of the Sirens Women's Motorcycle Club of New York City, 1983. By 1984, our club had fought for and won the right to ride at the front of the New York City Pride March, in front of several gay men's clubs whose members contested our placement bitterly. They complained that they couldn't bear to ride behind women. They just couldn't bear it. Visually, it would kill them. But we prevailed. The reason we prevailed was, I think, was our argument, our best argument, our only really good argument, was that we would appear to be men if we didn't go first, if we weren't centered and at the front. And it was true, and everybody knew it. So, and you know, the gay men's clubs came around and rode behind us and played pool with us in some of the clubs on occasion. And you know, when the Dykes on Bikes led New York City Pride, nobody mistook any of us for a man. So that's all I have for now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That's just really, really great. I think you've inspired a lot of the women here who were very happy to hear your story and happy to chat about it. Okay, so given where we are in the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls, I thought I would talk a little bit tonight about the importance of nonviolent action in creating a culture of resistance. Because as many of us know, violence against women and girls, often lesbians in particular, is on the rise. And I thought Taya's talk was completely fascinating, and I'm so excited to think more about collective effervescence and how we can cultivate it at the convention. And also, I want us to be very deliberate here. We are engaged in a political movement to liberate women, and that's what the Fall Convention is about. Most of us probably think that nonviolent action is a good thing to commit to because it's the right thing to do. And I think that is 100% correct. But the importance of nonviolent action takes on a different meaning when we're talking about using it in the context of building a culture of resistance, which is what we're doing in the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls. Specifically, the importance of nonviolent action in creating a culture of resistance is that it turns the importance of nonviolent action as the proper moral stance into a deliberate strategy to advance our movement's aims. This worked brilliantly for the suffragists. As the movement was gaining steam, the women started standing sentinel outside the White House. People walking down Pennsylvania Avenue could see with their own eyes the men who spat at them, the men who yelled at them, and eventually the police officers who manhandled them. Throughout it all, the women stood their ground without engaging at all. This also worked brilliantly for the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Everyone could see that the Black women and men sitting at lunch counters were having drinks thrown in their faces and cigarettes put out on their bodies. Everyone could see the police dogs, the police sick dogs on them during peaceful protests and marches. They never fought back with violence. This works as a strategy because it makes it clear that it is the movement activists who are the grown-ups in the picture and their enemies who are acting violently. It's then that public sympathy starts to shift and build. I can't stress enough how important it is for women to commit to this principle intellectually and emotionally, and it isn't always easy. I'd like to say a few things about events that occurred at Speaker's Corner in Philadelphia a few weeks ago. Some things we got right and some things we got wrong. I was there with several very brilliant, determined, and outspoken women. And if you have not seen the video of the event, please watch it on Amy Seuss's YouTube channel, known Heretic. It was August 7th. When we arrived and started to set up, we could see a man walking by wearing a miniskirt and makeup, and a young woman with a sound system sitting on the ground near where we were. So we knew to expect trouble. We did not expect as much trouble as we got. For the most part, I think we did great. We remained very calm in the face of some extremely obnoxious behavior. Jen Thomas managed to keep the sound going, and I just kept talking into the mic. One thing I regret was engaging with one of our detractors at all. A woman was directly in front of me, obscuring my view to the video. And she was making a bunch of noise and hand gestures. And at one point I stopped my speech and said, "I'm not afraid of you," which was true. But I think it would have been preferable not to engage with her at all. One other woman who was there almost lost her cool and went after another of our detractors, and we were able to hold her back. This is what I mean about having both an intellectual and an emotional commitment to this. It is very easy to lose our cool in the heat of the moment, and it is very important that we do not do that. We aim to win. The public will eventually come around, and we can help that process by demonstrating again and again that we are the victims of injustice here. We have to show the public this visually. We will eventually get our message out, and we want it to be the right one. As for the September convention, we don't anticipate any problems, but we have to be prepared. To that end, we are in talks with the hotel about security. Of course, that will be a very different environment from what we're used to. If anyone acts inappropriately at the hotel security can kick them out according to their own rules. We've made it clear on the website that this is to be a professional and business-like event, and inappropriate behavior will not be tolerated. We will be within our rights if we need to enforce that at any time. But we also have to be clear that we are all responsible for our own behavior. If one of our opponents shows up and starts acting up, we can and will take all appropriate precautions. But we all need to understand that this is a very dangerous time to be a woman, and particularly to be a TERF. We need to understand the risks that we are taking when we exercise our right to freedom of assembly. We want the fall convention to be an example of how women can build community and build a culture of resistance by exercising our right to freedom of assembly, and we aim to make that happen. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who is here. And now I will turn it over to Austin, who has some questions. Austin, many of you may know, Austin serves as our main volunteer coordinator, and she's here to handle questions and discussion.
Yeah, so I have a few questions of my own, but if anybody wants to put questions in the Q&A, I'll happily read your questions to the panelists as well. I don't have any cool stories. I've only been aware of radical feminism for a handful of years, and I haven't had the chance to attend any significant size women-only spaces, but the convention will be my first in-person women-only space of any significant size. So I'm super excited about it, and I'm really excited to meet everyone there who I've been working with for the last couple of years. So my first question for all the panelists or anyone who wants to answer is, it seems like very few are fighting back and preserving women-only spaces. What happens when these spaces go away? What is lost with them, and how can we bring them back? Is that too vague of a question, or does anyone have an answer?
I don't know, Austin, but do you think it would be good for the panelists to turn our videos on at this point collectively, or no?
Yeah, I think when you're speaking at least, but yeah, it'd be great.
Let's all turn our videos on.
I'll have a crack at it. I think, and it's something that I mentioned, I think one of the most valuable things that's lost or that happens is that imitations start to crop up. It's like, well, we can do this instead of a women-only space. We can have this, and we can make this concession or that concession, and there is a feeling of like it's better than nothing. Bringing women to the point where a pale imitation or really awful imitation, where women are saying it's better than nothing, is a very, very destructive thing, because it's not better than nothing. I mean, sometimes nothing is better than garbage. So I think that that's one of the real dangers of when all these spaces go away. I had those spaces, and I can tell you, sometimes nothing is way better than garbage.
Yeah, that reminds me of something Derek Jensen often writes about, calling it a toxic mimic, something that it's supposed to take the place of something, but it's absolutely inverted, and it's not the point anymore.
So I could maybe, so I really think, sort of building on what Marian said, I think one of the best ways to persuade women that women-only spaces are valuable is for women to experience them. So I would have been completely on board with women-only spaces for a long time. It just wasn't sort of the direction I was going in my life. And then I attended an event in 2019 that really just completely changed everything about how I think about this. And I'll just say briefly, this was very explicitly a women-only event. And the event organizers were a bit concerned about pushback from men who pretend to be women, which didn't happen. There was no pushback. It remained a women-only space with no problems. And I have this very vivid recollection of walking alone in the woods in the middle of the afternoon, just by myself, not even really thinking about it. And I heard what was unmistakably a human footstep behind me. And I froze, just automatically froze. It was just, it wasn't even, it wasn't even deliberate. It was just an instinctual sense of fear that there was a human being walking behind me. And in the next moment, I reminded myself that it was a women-only space. And the feeling of relief and relaxation that came with that knowledge is, it was a physical sensation. I will never, I mean, of course it was emotional and intellectual, but it was a physical sensation that I will never, ever forget. And I remember turning around, and there was a woman walking several steps behind me, and we smiled at each other and we went on our way. And I obviously cannot relate with Marian's experiences growing up and becoming a lesbian and being in lesbian only spaces. However, that experience changed my life, and I will always understand the value of women only spaces. And as Marian said, it's hard to understand the value of women only spaces if you haven't experienced them.
So a participant, an attendee asks, was it lawsuits that ended women's spaces, or was it infiltration, basically? Does anyone have any ideas about that? Go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, it was lawsuits. I think it was lawsuits and changes in the law. I mean, it didn't, some of it was legislation. I operated a lesbian guest house in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And what happened, the reason I'm not still doing that, because I loved it. I loved doing that. I loved hosting happy lesbians from all over the world, right? What happened was the Massachusetts laws changed so that it became sex discrimination to exclude men. And Massachusetts was not unique in that respect.
Good.
What about, and this is kind of a combination of this question and the previous question, what about all of the women who say it's okay, we need to accommodate our trans women allies? Capitulation. What about the capitulation of women, many of whom, claim to stand for women's sex-based rights, and then also say it's important to accommodate our trans women allies? To what extent, I guess it's a tough question, because I guess the question is, to what extent are women complicit in all of this? And that's a really tough question. But there's nothing new about women participating in our own oppression. I'd love to hear what anyone else thinks about that.
That is, I mean, Simone de Beauvoir, Audre Lorde, Jean Sharp, Politics of Nonviolent Action. Anybody who has written about this or thought about this will all say that the oppressor, part of the way the oppressor works, and the only way the oppressor can really succeed is if the oppressed themselves are complicit. They have to be complicit. But it's a catch-22. Once women experience, not just once, not just twice, but day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, women-only spaces, the intrusion of men pretending to be women is absolutely unacceptable under any circumstances at all. It's like I don't care where they go, just someplace else. But it's a catch-22 because you won't experience that because you haven't experienced that, so you think it's not worth experiencing. And it's very, very difficult. There has to be a way, and you know, whatever kind of action, and I think there's got to be like some legal way to do it that I have no clue, that will allow. I mean, whether it has to be you make up a religion or you make up a sorority, because apparently sororities can now keep out men. There has to be a way to do it and have enough women experience it for a long enough time so that they go, oh my God, this is so much better. How did I ever think that one of these penis people should ever be among us? So it's really difficult, and I don't know the answer.
Just a quick fun fact before we move on. I read today that at the University of Alabama, I'm not a huge fan of sororities, but I did read, and I was very happy to see 100% of sororities at the University of Alabama have rejected a man who pretends to be a woman. So everything is not all lost.
That's great. So why do you think men care so much to stop women from convening together in the absence of men? Do you really think they're afraid of women gaining power this way? Or, I mean, like, what could they possibly be afraid of with patriarchy being so solid and so unbreakable? It seems like it's just such a fortress. Why would they fight so hard to keep us from gathering together?
They saw what happened last time we were allowed to do it. I mean,
what was that? What happened? Just
the consequences. The consequences were terrible for them. I mean, they almost lost patriarchy. I mean, they really came close to losing patriarchy in the 1970s. They're not going to allow that to happen again. I mean, the women got together in consciousness raising groups, and men didn't try to get into those consciousness raising groups because, you know, what were they talking? How boring. It was women's stuff they were talking about. Right at that point, men didn't want to get into it, and you know, they paid. they paid the price for their inattention. Women who are in consciousness raising groups left their husbands, having talked about their abusive relationships. They changed their lives completely. They changed their personalities completely. They made women's shelters where battered women's shelters where the men couldn't even get at their servants. And some of the women even became lesbians and rejected all men. I mean, just from the consciousness raising groups. And, so they know that. They know that now.
So I had another question that you think you might have just answered, which is if violence is the way that men have maintained their power over women. They've by violence and by the threat of violence. And so how can women non-violently emancipate ourselves when the dominant class is constantly using violence to keep us down? But now you're saying that women gathering is enough to just to rise up to take on patriarchy. That's pretty profound. Go ahead, Marian.
The things that we did back then were, making sure women could have their own bank accounts, credit cards, equal pay, childcare, battered women's shelters, rape crisis centers, and all of that was geared towards allowing women to walk away from men, to get out of relationships with men. Patriarchy is I mean, it's male socialization, and the fundamental, the fundamental lessons of male socialization that every male is taught from birth is domination and violation of boundaries. And they do it to each other, and they particularly do it to women. So, I mean, to be able to, what we did back then, what was done back then, allowed women to escape domination and violation of their boundaries. I mean, I used to hear the phrase "abandoning men," and Lauren said they realized that was what was happening, and it enraged them because they're taught they're supposed to dominate and violate women, but if women are just walking away from them, because now there were all these things that allowed women to walk away from them, including meeting on our own without men and talking about more ways we could walk away from them. That's infuriating. That's infuriating when your entire worth as a human being, as a male, is like, I need to dominate and violate, and all of a sudden you can't do it anymore.
Austin? So I just want to jump in also and say, going way back. I don't know if this is true. I'm talking prehistorical. But my understanding from reading the lore is that men have never liked it when women gather and talk at all, because there was a time before men understood human reproduction. But of course, women did. Women understood what was happening to their bodies, and women knew how to prevent pregnancy. Women knew how to terminate pregnancy. Women talked about these things. Dangerous things happen to men when women talk. And when men started figuring out how human reproduction works, right? Like, I had sex with her 9 months ago, and now there's this kid and it looks like me, right? It took them that long to kind of figure out what was going on, whereas women knew the whole time. Once they figured that out, the first thing they had to do was stop us from talking with one another. They did all sorts of other horrible things, like declare us to be their property and make us take their names and control our reproductive lives. But the most important thing for them was to keep us from talking with one another, because they know that when women talk with one another, the patriarchy is really threatened.
The red tent, the first women-only space. Well, probably not the first, the biblical women-only space. So
I'll just add on to that.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that alongside dangerous things happening to men when women talk, there's also the component that by keeping us from talking, they're forcing us to reinvent the wheel, essentially, every generation. Every young woman has to find out that, no, that guy 10 years older than you doesn't actually think you're mature for his age. And by the time, you've gotten through that vulnerable age and more or less figured these things out, the men have already gotten what they need from you, and they can move on to the next generation of young women who don't know yet, because part of what they do is they help us, or induce us rather, to dismiss women older than us as out of touch, crones, etc. It's like raising a new batch of like lab fruit flies all the time.
Yeah, I often think about that. I don't like, if it weren't for my husband or my husband at the time identifying, I don't know how I would have found it. It's like I knew something was wrong with it, and I had to go digging so hard to find what the women had written. And then I was like, the women already thought all this through. Why haven't I been taught this? Why hasn't someone told me? Why isn't it standard for women to be educated in our history? I just don't understand, or in our movements, at least. I mean, we should at least know about women's movements and what they accomplished. Great.
Also, older women really can't universally be trusted. I mean, it's older women who, in many cultures, are the ones who deliver their daughters to the patriarchy in one way or another. It's women who perform FGM in every culture that has it. and women try to marry their daughters off. You know, it's hard to, you know, so patriarchy has been very clever in breaking that any bond that there might be, or any likelihood that younger women are going to believe what older women tell them.
Right. And even then, the system of power is set up so that if they don't have the FGM, or if they don't have their feet bound, they won't get a husband. And so they won't be able to advance in the society or be socially acceptable. And so it's kind of it's useless anyway to even rebel.
Well, in fairness to the older women, it may be their opinion that it may seem to them sincerely that the best chance that their daughters have of surviving is to conform.
Yeah, it does. There have been, I mean, Sheila Jeffries has written about this, like in China, marriage refusers, a group of women who separated, talked among themselves, and came to the conclusion, there's this group of women over a fairly long period of time, and I forget exactly when in China, who separated, talked among themselves, and came up with, oh, we should never ever marry men, and we should never ever bind our feet. And if we do have kids, we're not going to bind our daughters' feet. And again, that was in a time and place, and I don't remember all the circumstances, where this group of women over a number of years, I mean, they even invented their own language, you know, written language, so they could communicate. Women talking among themselves, free of any male eavesdroppers, came up with, our best shot in life is to abandon men.
Yeah, it really does truly seem to me, from my experience, that women who are in relationships with men are serving those men, and the men in those relationships are being served. It really is pretty clear in a lot of my personal, and I know that's probably not the way it always is, but I think that in my standard and in my upbringing, that was the pattern. And I don't know if, I mean, I don't, it doesn't seem like that's what the mainstream thinking is. It seems like mainstream thinking is that the man is doing all the work and the woman is just living off of his paycheck or something like that. But to me, it looked like it's always the woman doing all the work and the man is coming home and relaxing and being served, basically. And so I'm always really congratulatory of my friends who leave my female friends who leave their heterosexual relationships. I'm always like, yeah, dump him, get out of there. So on that note, does anyone have any final thoughts you want to add, or does anyone have any more questions for the panelists? If not, I think we can end.
Austin, there are some things in Q&A. I don't know if you've already.
Yeah, I think I already asked those.
Oh, got you. Thanks, Nina.
All right, thanks everybody for coming today. Have a beautiful rest of your evening. We'll see you next time.
Bye, thank you.